The desert sun clawed at Sergeant Elias Boone's weathered face, though he barely felt it now, curled in the suffocating gloom of a dry well. At 58, his knees ached from years of wrench work on farm tractors and army jeeps, but his grip on the rusted wrench in his hand was iron. The Iraq heat, relentless even in March 2003, baked the sandstone rim above, sending trickles of dust into the well where Elias and four others hid. The air stank of sweat and cordite, the acrid residue of the ambush that had torn their convoy apart an hour ago. His ears still rang with the screams of burning Humvees, the crack of AK-47s, and the dull thump of an RPG that had flipped their truck like a child's toy. Elias pressed his back against the well's cracked wall, the stone cool but jagged, biting through his fatigues. His breath was shallow, deliberate, as boots crunched on the sand above. Insurgent voices, sharp, guttural Arabic, drifted down, too close. He couldn't understand the words, but the menace in their tone was universal. He glanced at the others crammed into the well's narrow belly. Private Torres, a wiry 22-year-old with a bloodied arm, Corporal Hensley, a logistics clerk whose glasses fogged with panic, and two civilians, a translator named Amira and her teenage son, Jamal, their eyes wide with terror. The well, barely 6 feet wide, felt like a coffin, its damp walls slick with ancient moss, the air heavy with the mineral tang of trapped water long gone. "Stay still," Elias whispered, his voice low but firm, the kind he'd used to calm his kids during Midwest storms decades ago. Torres shot him a glare, his young face taut with pain and skepticism. "You sure this hole ain't our grave, Sarge?" he hissed, clutching his wounded arm. Elias ignored the jab, though it stung. The unit had called him Grandpa behind his back, mocking his slow gait and grease-stained hands, as if his years fixing engines in the Great Depression and Korea meant nothing in this high-tech war. But Elias knew machines, how to break them, how to make them sing. And now, hiding in this forgotten well, that knowledge was their only edge. The ambush had come at dawn, as their convoy rolled through a narrow pass near Al-Nazariya. Elias had been in the third Humvee, tinkering with a jammed radio mount, when the first RPG screamed in. The lead vehicle erupted in flames, and chaos swallowed the rest. Elias had dragged Torres and Hensley from the wreckage, spotting Amira and Jamal fleeing a shattered civilian truck. With insurgents closing in, he'd remembered the well, spotted days earlier during a supply run, half buried in a dune, its crumbling rim hidden by scrub. He'd led them here, crawling through sand, praying the enemy wouldn't notice the tracks. Now, the well's darkness was both shield and cage. The heat pressed down, though the sun couldn't reach them. Elias's throat burned, his canteen nearly empty. Dehydration was a quiet killer, and he felt it in the ache of his temples, the dry crack of his lips. Amira, crouched beside him, clutched Jamal, her whispered prayers in Arabic blending with the distant hum of a black hawk circling uselessly miles away. Hensley, pale and trembling, kept wiping his glasses, muttering about supply routes and protocol, as if paperwork could save them. Torres, slumped against the wall, groaned softly, blood seeping through the bandage Elias had rigged from a torn sleeve. "Quiet," Elias hissed again, as a shadow flickered above. Boots scraped closer, and a rifle barrel glinted, catching a sliver of sunlight. His heart thudded, each beat loud in his ears. He'd seen combat in Korea, patched tanks under fire, but this was different. Claustrophobic, personal. The insurgents were hunting, methodical, their voices rising and falling like wolves circling prey. Elias tightened his grip on the wrench, its familiar weight grounding him. He'd fixed his father's tractor with it at 15, during the lean years when dust storms choked their farm. That wrench had been his lifeline then, and it might be again. "Why'd you pick this hole, old man?" Torres muttered, his voice sharp despite the pain. "We're trapped. Shoulda run for the ridge." Elias met his eyes, seeing the fear beneath the bravado. "Ridge was open ground," he said evenly. "They'd have cut us down. This well's hidden, and I know hidden." He didn't mention Korea, the frozen foxholes where he'd learned to read terrain, to find the cracks in the earth that saved lives. Torres snorted but said nothing, his distrust palpable. Amira's voice broke the tension. They're close, she whispered, her English accented but clear. I heard them say, search the ruins. They know someone survived. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady, fixed on Elias. Jamal, barely 16, pressed against her, his breathing ragged. Elias nodded, his mind racing. The well was a gamble, but it bought time. He'd scouted it days ago, noting its depth, its camouflage of sand and scrub. His old habit of mapping terrain, learned in Korea, honed on Iowa farms, hadn't failed him yet. Hensley, still clutching his useless clipboard, whispered, "We need to signal for rescue." "The radio." "Radio's dead," Elias cut in, his tone sharp but kind. "And signaling now'd bring them right to us." Hensley shrank back, his faith in protocol crumbling. Elias felt a pang of pity but pushed it aside. Pity wouldn't keep them alive. The air grew heavier, the well's walls seeming to close in. Elias's knees throbbed, but he didn't shift, afraid any sound would betray them. Above, the insurgents' voices faded, then returned, closer. A pebble fell, clattering against the well's rim, and Jamal flinched, his elbow knocking a loose stone. The sound echoed, sharp and damning. Elias froze, his hand clamping Jamal's arm gently but firmly. "Easy, son," he murmured, his voice the same he'd used to soothe his daughter during a tornado watch. The boy nodded, eyes wide. Torres hissed, "Kid's gonna get us killed." Amira's glare silenced him, but the tension spiked. Elias felt it in his bones. The group was fracturing, fear eroding trust. He needed to hold them together. But how? His mind flicked to 1951, Korea's frozen hills, where he'd kept his squad calm by humming Chattanooga Choo Choo, the old Glenn Miller tune his mother loved. He didn't hum now, too risky, but the memory steadied him. He'd survived worse odds with less. Then came the sound he dreaded, a metallic clank, like a rifle tapping stone. The insurgents were probing the well's rim. Elias's pulse hammered, his mind mapping the terrain above. The well was deep, its entrance narrow, but a grenade could end them all. He scanned the group, their faces pale in the dim light. Torres's wound was worsening, the bandage soaked. Amira's prayers grew softer, desperate. Hensley's hands shook. Jamal's eyes begged for hope. Elias's fingers traced the wrench, his mind turning. The insurgents hadn't found them yet, but time was running out. Torres needed a medic, and the well's air wouldn't last. He knew machines, how to break them, how to use them. The convoy's wreckage was nearby, scattered across the dunes. If he could reach it, use its parts, maybe he could turn the tables. But first, they had to survive the next hour. A shout above made Elias's blood run cold. Footsteps circled the well, and a flashlight beam stabbed down, slicing the darkness. The group pressed tighter against the walls, breath held. Elias's eyes locked on the beam, his mind racing. He'd been overlooked his whole life, by bosses, by officers, by this war's tech-obsessed kids. But he knew the desert, new machines, new survival. And he'd be damned if he let these people die in this hole. The beam flicked away, the voices receding slightly. Elias exhaled, his resolve hardening. They needed a plan, and he'd build it, piece by piece, like he'd rebuilt engines in the dark. "Hang on," he whispered to the group, his voice steady despite the fear. "We're getting out of this. What would you do in their place?" Share your thoughts below. The well's darkness clung to Sergeant Elias Boone like a second skin, the air thick with the mineral tang of ancient stone and the faint iron scent of Private Torres's blood. The insurgents' flashlight beam had retreated minutes ago, but their boots still crunched faintly above, circling the dunes near Al-Nazariah. Elias, 58, his knuckles white around his trusty wrench, knew time was slipping away. Torres's wound was festering, his groans growing weaker. Amira's whispered prayers for her son Jamal faltered, and Corporal Hensley's nervous fidgeting threatened to betray them all. The Iraq sun, merciless even in March 2003, baked the well's rim, sending heat waves that shimmered in Elias's mind. He had to get them out, using the only thing he trusted: his hands, his know-how, and the wreckage of their convoys scattered nearby. Elias's mind churned, mapping the terrain from memory. The convoy's remains, twisted Humvees, a shattered fuel truck, lay 100 yards off, half buried in sand. He'd fixed engines under worse conditions in Korea, rewiring tanks while shells screamed overhead. Now, his old-school mechanical tricks could be their salvation. "Listen up," he whispered, his voice steady as a tractor's hum. "We're not dying in this hole. I've got a plan." Torres, slumped against the well's mossy wall, snorted weakly. "A plan? You gonna fix our way out with that wrench, Grandpa?" The nickname stung, but Elias let it slide. The kid was scared, bleeding, and young enough to think tech solved everything. "Something like that," Elias said, his Iowa drawl calm. He outlined his idea. The fuel truck's battery, if intact, could spark a distraction. A few wires, some scrap metal, and the insurgents' own curiosity could be turned against them. "I'll rig a decoy," he said. "Draw em away. Then we move." Hensley, clutching his cracked glasses, shook his head. "That's insane. They'll hear us climbing out. We need to wait for rescue." His voice cracked, betraying his reliance on protocol. Amira, her dark eyes steady despite the fear, cut in. Rescue won't come in time. My son needs air. Torres needs a doctor." Jamal, pressed against her, nodded silently, his teenage bravado gone. Elias met her gaze, seeing the same resolve he'd seen in his wife during the lean years of the 30s, when they'd scraped by on grit and hope. The well's cramped walls pressed harder, the air growing stale. Elias's knees ached, but he focused on the plan. He'd need to slip out, reach the wreckage, and rig a sparking battery to mimic a radio signal or engine flare, something to lure the insurgents away. It was risky, but he'd crawled through frozen mud in Korea to patch a tank's fuel line. This was just another job. The group's tension thickened. Torres, pale and sweating, muttered, "You're too old for this, Sarge. You'll get us caught." Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't snap back. Instead, he thought of his father, who'd taught him to fix a tractor's carburetor by lantern light during the Depression. "Age don't mean weak," he said softly. "Means I've done this before." Torres looked away, unconvinced, but Amira's nod gave Elias strength. A sudden clatter above froze them. A canteen rolled across the well's rim, dislodged by a careless boot. Sand trickled down, dusting Elias's face. He held up a hand, silencing Hensley's gasp. The insurgents' voices returned, sharper now, as if arguing. Elias's heart pounded, but his hands stayed steady, tracing the wrench's familiar edges. He'd needed to pry open the battery casing, maybe even as a weapon. The voices faded, but the danger lingered. They had minutes, maybe less. Elias crouched lower, sketching his plan in the dirt with a twig. "I'll climb out, get to the fuel truck. There's a battery, wires, maybe some flares. I can make a spark, big enough to look like a signal. They'll chase it, think we're there. We slip out the other way, head for the ridge." He pointed upward, where the dune slope hit a shallow gully he'd spotted days ago. "It's cover, and it's close to a patrol route. We move fast, we're home free." Hensley shook his head again. "You'll never make it. They're watching the wreckage." His voice trembled, but Elias saw the fear wasn't just for himself, it was for all of them. "I've crawled through worse," Elias said, his tone firm but kind. "Korea, 51. Fixed a tank's treads while snipers took shots. I know how to move quiet." He didn't mention the frostbite that had nearly cost him his fingers, or the buddy he'd lost to a stray bullet. The memory fueled him now, sharpening his focus. Amira spoke up, her voice low. "I trust you, Sergeant. But Jamal, he's not strong enough to run far." Her eyes flicked to her son, who looked small in the well's gloom. Elias nodded, his mind adjusting. Then we carry him if we have to. We're not leaving anyone. His words echoed his old squad's creed in Korea. No man left behind. It was a promise he'd kept then, and he'd keep it now. Torres, grimacing through his pain, finally spoke. If you screw this up, we're dead. Elias met his eyes. I won't. The private's doubt lingered, but he nodded, too weak to argue. Elias felt the weight of their lives, 4 souls, pinned on his plan. He thought of his daughter, now grown, who'd sent him off to this war with a hug and a prayer. You're tougher than all of them, Dad, she'd said. He clung to that now. The plan took shape, but a new threat loomed. Torres's breathing grew shallow, his bandage soaked through. Elias tore another strip from his own shirt, rewrapping the wound with practiced hands. Hang on, kid, he murmured, his voice the same he'd used to calm his son during a fever years ago. But the blood loss was bad, and time was shorter than he'd thought. They needed to move before Torres faded, or the insurgents returned. Dusk settled over the Iraqi desert, painting the dunes in shades of amber and shadow. Sergeant Elias Boone, 58, crouched at the well's rim, his wrench heavy in his hand, the air thick with the acrid sting of cordite and the faint gasoline tang from the convoy's wreckage. The insurgents' voices had faded west, drawn by the sparking battery he'd rigged an hour ago, a flicker of light and smoke that mimicked a dying radio signal. Below, in the well's damp gloom, Private Torres clung to life, his wound a ticking clock. Amira and Jamal huddled close, their breaths shallow, while Corporal Hensley's nervous fidgeting had stilled, replaced by a fragile trust in Elias's plan. The gully, their path to safety, lay a half-mile east, but every step would test Elias's grit. His body ached, his canteen was dry, and the desert's heat still pressed like a furnace. Elias scanned the horizon, his eyes sharp from years of reading terrain in Korea and Iowa fields. The insurgent silhouettes moved toward the wreckage, their shouts faint but urgent. His plan was working, but it wouldn't last. Now, he whispered, signaling the group to climb. His hands, calloused from decades of wrench work, steadied Jamal as the boys scrambled up, followed by Amira. Hensley helped Torres, whose groans cut through the silence. Elias went last, his knees protesting but his resolve ironclad. They had one shot. The desert was a maze of dunes and scrub, the sand cool underfoot but treacherous, shifting with each step. Elias led, his memory of the gully's path clear as a blueprint. He'd mapped it days ago, a habit from Korea, where a wrong turn meant death. The group moved low, hugging the shadows. Torres, supported by Hensley, stumbled, his blood-soaked bandage a grim reminder of time's weight. Amira's eyes darted, protective of Jamal, who clutched a small knife Elias had given him, a tool, not a weapon, to ease the boy's fear. A sudden shout froze them. An insurgent, straggling behind his patrol, stood 50 yards off, his rifle glinting. Elias's heart thudded, but he waved the group down into a shallow dip. "Stay low," he hissed, his voice steady as it had been calming his squad in 51. The insurgent scanned, then turned back toward the wreckage, drawn by a fresh puff of smoke from Elias's rigged trap. The battery's spark had caught a rag, just as he'd planned. He exhaled, his mind flicking to his father's words during the Depression. "Fix what's broke, son, and keep moving." He was fixing this now. They reached the gully, its walls steep but offering cover. Elias's plan hinged on reaching a patrol route a mile north, where U.S. forces might pass. But Torres's breathing was ragged, his face gray. Elias knelt, checking the wound. "You're tougher than this, kid," he said, his tone soft but firm, echoing how he'd coached his son through a broken arm years ago. Torres managed a weak grin. "Don't let me slow you, Grandpa." Elias's chest tightened. He'd proved them wrong, all of them. The gully was a lifeline, but danger stalked them. A distant hum grew louder, a drone, its whine cutting through the desert silence. Elias cursed under his breath. His trap had bought time, but the insurgents were adapting, likely radioing for support. He scanned the gully, spotting a cluster of rocks. "There," he whispered, leading them to a makeshift hide. The drone passed overhead, its red light blinking like a predator's eye. Jamal whimpered, and Amira hushed him, her strength mirroring Elias's wife during hard times. Hensley, clutching his glasses, murmured, "We're gonna make it, right?" Elias nodded. "We will." He adjusted the plan. The drone meant they couldn't wait for a patrol. They had to signal for rescue. Elias's mind raced, landing on the flares he'd seen in the wreckage. If he could retrieve one, ignite it from the gully's edge, it might draw a Black Hawk. But it meant doubling back, risking exposure. He looked at the group, Torres fading, Jamal trembling, Amira resolute, Hensley trusting. "I'm going for a flare," he said. "Stay here. Move only if I signal." Torres grabbed his arm, weak but fierce. "You're crazy, Sarge. Don't die for us." Elias met his eyes. "I'm not dying. And neither are you." He slipped off, crawling through the sand, his body protesting but his focus razor-sharp. The wreckage was close, the insurgents distracted by his earlier trap. He found a flare, its casing dented but intact, and tucked it into his jacket, next to the wrench, his talisman, a piece of home. Back in the gully, Elias prepared the flare. The drone was gone, but boots crunched nearby, too close. He needed a diversion, something to pull the insurgents away again. He spotted a rusted fuel can, half buried. With his wrench, he pried it open, spilling gasoline into the sand. A match from his pocket lit a small fire, its smoke rising like a beacon. The insurgents shouted, rushing toward it, just as he'd hoped. Elias ignited the flare, its red glow arcing skyward, a desperate prayer. The group watched, breathless. Minutes dragged, the desert silent except for the crackle of Elias's decoy fire. Then, a low thrum, a Black Hawk, its rotors slicing the night. Elias's heart leaped, but the insurgents heard it too, their shouts turning frantic. He waved the group forward, helping Torres as they stumbled toward the patrol route. The chopper's spotlight swept the dunes, pinning them briefly before locking on the insurgents, who scattered under its glare. The Black Hawk landed, dust swirling. Medics rushed out, taking Torres first. Elias helped Amira and Jamal aboard, then Hensley, whose relieved grin said more than words. As Elias climbed in, a medic clapped his shoulder. "Hell of a job, Sarge." Elias nodded, his throat tight. The wrench, still in his hand, felt heavier now, a weight of survival, of proving them wrong. The chopper lifted, the desert shrinking below. Elias's hands trembled, not from fear but from the cost. His left arm throbbed, grazed by a stray bullet during his crawl to the wreckage. He'd ignored it, like he'd ignored the ache of being called Grandpa. He thought of Korea, of buddies lost, and of his wife's letters, urging him to come home whole. He'd kept his promise, but it hurt, physically, emotionally. The wrench, his father's gift, was scuffed, its handle worn. He'd almost lost it in the sand, a sacrifice he'd been willing to make. In the chopper, Torres, strapped to a stretcher, met Elias's eyes. "You're all right, old man," he rasped, a smile breaking through. Amira touched Elias's hand, whispering, "Thank you." Jamal, clutching his knife, nodded, tears in his eyes. Hensley, glasses fogged, said, "I'm putting you in my report, Sarge. They need to know." Elias shrugged, but pride warmed him. He'd been overlooked, underestimated, but his hands, his wisdom, had saved them. Back at base, word spread. The unit's commander, a young captain who'd once scoffed at Elias's outdated skills, shook his hand. "Your trick with the battery, it's going in the playbook," he said. Elias nodded, thinking of the gully, the flare, the lives he'd pulled from that well. He'd changed their story, maybe the wars, in a small way. Wisdom, he knew, outlasted doubt. As the medics checked his arm, Elias looked at the wrench, its scratches telling a story of survival. He thought of his daughter, who'd called him tougher than the rest. She was right. The desert hadn't broken him, and neither had their doubts. He'd carried them out, not with youth or tech, but with the stubborn grit of a man who'd lived through harder times.